Welcome to this special episode where I had the pleasure of chatting with Hazel Martin, who's an investigative journalist and host of the documentary The Man in the Mask and Orkney Murder, and the documentary's director, Stephen Bennett. This 3-part documentary, The Man in the Mask, is available now to watch on BBC iPlayer, and it revisits the shocking murder of Shamsuddin Mahmood in 1994, which was the first murder in Orkney in 25 years. The series breaks down the investigation into the case, which initially focused on Michael Ross, a 15-year-old schoolboy, as the prime suspect. Over the years, new evidence emerged, leading to Michael Ross's conviction and a life sentence in 2008. The documentary features interviews with key witnesses, family members, and insights from the community, providing a comprehensive look at the notorious crime and its aftermath. And if you haven't already watched it, I'd highly recommend doing so before listening to this episode, as there are a number of spoilers and information that didn't make the cut, as well as behind-the-scenes sneak peeks. But before we get into that, let me tell you a bit more about Hazel and Stephen. Hazel is a multi-award-nominated Scottish journalist, known for her compelling storytelling and on-screen presence. She is a reporter, production journalist and TV presenter, currently working for BBC Scotland News as a producer and reporter, and has a special interest in documentaries, investigations and original journalism. Her notable work includes The Man in the Mask and Orkney Murder, Body on the Beach, What Happened to Annie, and 2 Panorama specials, Britain's Ketamine Crisis and Binge Drinking and Me. Hazel's reporting is marked by an emotional depth, as she not only tells stories, but also lives them, making her a reliable and relatable face for investigative journalism. Her recent work, as seen in her BBC Panorama special, Binge Drinking and Me, where she used her own story to highlight a public health crisis, has been particularly praised for its balance and the consequences of binge drinking. You can find out more information and follow Hazel on Instagram at Hazel Reporting. Stephen Bennett is a renowned documentary director known for his intimate, engaging shooting style and strong characters. His work has been recognised with numerous awards, including 3 BAFTA Scotland Awards and 4 Royal Television Society Awards. Stephen's documentaries have significantly influenced government policy and have been used by institutions such as the criminal justice system and Glasgow City Council. His notable work includes Eminent Monsters, which is a documentary that led to the first ever report on the use of psychological torture by member states of the United Nations. There's also Darren McGarvey's Class Wars, which is a series that Stephen directed, which examined the impact of social class in Scotland. And there's Lockerbie, Our Story, which is a documentary that Stephen produced and directed that told the poignant story of 6 passengers on board the Pan Am 103. For more information and to explore Stephen's work, you can visit his official website at stephenabennett.com. So now you know a wee bit about Hazel and Stephen, let's hear from them about their working relationship, before we'll then hear from them about working on The Man in the Mask. Have you worked together before, or was this your first time working together?
First and last, I would say.
No, what I know.
No, we've never worked together.
I was going to say, okay, no, you go on. You've made your bed. Go on.
No, we haven't worked before together. But I had a thrilling time with Hazel. And no, I think we would definitely work together again. I think we did something in my mind, in particular. I've never had anyone speak to. I've done my job for 30 years, and never once has anyone come up and said any of the films I've made have been binge watchable. And this, I mean, I've had like one of my old pals who I went to uni with, who I graduated in 95 because I'm so old. He contacted me out of the blue. I haven't spoken to him since 95, and he said, "I loved that. Me and my wife watched it. We binge watched it." And that word binge watch has been many. It's probably even been the singular kind of word that people have said about this project. So there's something about the series style, what Hazel brings to the thing. I think you make it very easy for an audience to understand twists and turns, because actually this is like 2 onions compressed into one. You know what I mean? It's got lots and lots of story parts to it. And I think what Hazel does is kind of voice that and give you a sense of what the story is and why different things are important. because it's non-chronological, as you see in the film. We kind of bounce time zones, which is, the modern vogue in lots of documentaries these days. But it's easy to get lost in when you're bouncing time. So Hazel does a great job. She's 2 box sets, 2 panoramas in, and probably a gazillion films to come. She'll be my boss one day.
How do you follow that? I'm like, well, Stephen, I guess, no, Stephen's obviously been, he said he's been doing this for 30 years, but I've never met someone so understated and modest. And even things like when I get something wrong or when I fumble a word, he'll say things like, oh yeah, it was just, a camera fault and stuff, and just trying to make you feel a bit better. So he's just amazing. And the way you're able to direct and just obviously tell you what you need to do, but in a way that is just so understandable and so at ease, it was really special. And yes, I hope we work together for years and years to come.
It was very good. I was saying she's got such a great at showing expression. So even just an eyebrow here or a little look there, it was just beautifully done. It just tells a whole different story. So it was layer on layer. It was good.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I was saying as well, ethics is a big thing in podcasting at the moment, true crime. And it was just so well ethically done as well. There was no sensational. It was beautiful.
It's a major important thing in broadcasting, in podcasting, in TV, in all genres, I think. In drama, I think we're seeing it as well. I think we really have to work harder to make sure that, one, we can get the trust and we have informed consent of contributors. Secondly, that they know what they're part of. They should know, like in this film, we took the film back up and showed some people. We showed all the sections to all the contributors. And then we also showed the mum and dad of the film before it was transmitted, because it's really important so that they should be able to see it before their neighbours see it, before someone in Tesco or Aldi or whatever shop you're in sees it, They should be able to see, because it's their son. Now, we would have done the same for Shamsuddin, and it's to our shame that we can't find Shamsuddin's family there in Bangladesh. And I know some of them have died in the intervening period, and we just can't find them. We've tried. So we would have done the same. And we did it with all the other contributors, and we would have done it with his family, had that been the case. But I think it's really important. So ethics in podcasting, ethics in broadcasting is really, really important,
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think on that point as well, there's just such a fascination with true crime, more so in recent years. Somebody once said to me, there's been a true crime glut, which I've never been able to forget. But it is really treading that line between this is something that people are watching, is bingeable, but then remembering that this happened. This isn't real. This isn't a made-up story. This actually happened to real people and impacted many, many lives. And at the heart of it all is Shamsuddin Mahmood, who lost his life in such a horrific and violent way.
Speaking of Shamsuddin Mahmood, can you tell us a bit about the Man in the Mask BBC documentary and Shamsuddin's tragic murder?
So this happened on Thursday, the 2nd of June in 1994. It was a nice summer's evening, and around 7:10 at night, a masked gunman walked into the Mumtaz Indian restaurant, which was in the centre of Kirkwall, and shot dead Shamsuddin Mahmood at point blank range. There were 14 witnesses, 13 members of the public, including children, just all sitting there having their dinner. One of the detectives at the scene said it was like the scene of a gangster movie. And Shamsuddin was shot once through the eye, and the bullet went into the wall behind him. And the only concrete evidence was the bullet casing, which was a 9mm Parabellum from Kirky Arsenal in India. Shamsuddin died on the way to hospital in the ambulance. He was a 26-year-old waiter. He was from Bangladesh. He'd moved to Southampton and London in May 1991. He had a brother here, his eldest brother, Abul Shafuddin, who lived in the UK. And Shamsuddin had worked 2 seasons in Orkney after a friend had told him about a job there. So he returned just a few weeks prior to his murder. And the murder itself, it was the first in Orkney for 25 years. And 14 years later, Michael Ross, who was an Orcadian, a local, who was aged just 15 at the time of the murder, he was found guilty at trial. And by then, he was a 29-year-old army sniper in the Black Watch. And to this day, Michael Ross maintains his innocence.
Just to colorise this, right, so this is a beautiful, tranquil, what do you call it, an archipelago of islands, 70-odd islands, Kirkwall being the the main centre of Orkney. Really, really beautiful. Summer's Eve, warm summer. Boats are coming in. As tourist season starts around about May. This is the only Indian restaurant in the island. That itself was fairly new. It was flooded when you opened the doors. That people who were using the restaurant had never been to Indian restaurants and who are Orkney natives, because this was the first one on the island. Probably one of the safest jobs you could think of. Working in a checkout is probably more dangerous, would you say? Certainly if you're living in America than it is working in an Indian restaurant in Kirkwall in the 1990s. And you have the testimonies of brutality of this murder is, as Hazel said, you have 13 diners in the restaurant at night time, 7 o'clock, 7:10. And then you have some members of staff. And someone comes in wearing a balaclava with no sense of hesitation, walks straight up to Shamsuddin and executes him in cold blood, shoots him through the eye, and then walks out just as calm. It feels like something out of a thriller or out of a TV kind of film you might have watched, or a Netflix. And that's the scene that's getting set. Michael was a schoolboy at that point. We will discuss whether he did it or not. But at that point, he was a 15-year-old schoolboy. There's a 13-year-old who's having a curry with mum and dad and other relatives. They are closer than you and I are. I mean, my computer's, they're 60 centimetres away from me. They were around with that to a meter from Shamsuddin. And that's the barbarity of this killing. And that's why this film's important, And that's why this story seems to just has a central presence in Scottish sort of psyche. But it's a story that doesn't go away. And I think it's because for many people, the thing doesn't add up, but also because of that sheer barbarity of the killing and the kind of inexplicableness of this crime. This is a guy doing his job who got up that morning, who then worked in a restaurant. He lived above the restaurant, As Hazel said, 2 seasons in. He comes back. He's only been in Kirkwall for 6 weeks before he's killed. And to this day, you have people who says Michael Ross did it. And to this day, he will say Michael Ross didn't do it.
Now you know a wee bit about what and who the documentary is about and who was behind the making of it. Now let's go a bit deeper and find out more about Hazel and Stephen's thoughts on this horrific crime. Here's some fascinating insights into the making of this documentary and why they felt it was important to make this documentary. So, Hazel, in the episodes at the beginning, you kind of were finding it a bit difficult, struggling to kind of see that this 15-year-old boy could have done that, could have come in and, like you've described, Stephen, something so barbaric and so calm. So, coming into it, both of you, what was your stance on it? Did you know a lot about it? There was a lot come out that you didn't know, and why now?
I think that exactly what you mentioned about how cool, calm and collected this person who carried out this barbaric crime was, walking into the restaurant calmly and collectively, shooting Shamsuddin Mahmood at point blank range and then just exiting. I think that it's really difficult to wrap your head around the fact that anybody would do that, not least a 15-year-old boy. So I was aware of the case and I knew what happened, albeit not to the same depth as we got into, because we got into it in such a big way, really did a deep dive. So I knew the timeline and I knew what had happened, as in what was reported and things, just throughout the years, more so obviously when I became a journalist. But I think, that made it really difficult from a jumping off point to, I guess, imagine that a teenager could do that.
Stephen, what about yourself?
So I'm a bit older than our young Hazel. So I remember 1994,
I'm not young.
I was, a year away from graduating. And I kind of remember the story, broadly speaking. I filmed in Orkney 2 times before this film, and I've been on holiday once with my family. But in 1994, I'd never been to Orkney. And so I remember hearing about it, but I didn't really think about it any more than just that kind of weird, what a crazy story. And then moved on with my life. Sorry to say that, but then moved on with my life, as we do with quite a lot of these type of things. I guess what you're asking is why now? That's the thing. And I was probably very scared as a director to make this film, because there's been so many films now. There's been some good and bad, as you'd imagine, when there's a collective of different films. And it was a very good one a friend of mine made for Amazon. I just went out just when we were kind of like mid-journey in this film. And he's a very accomplished filmmaker as well, and him and his producer. And so Leslie Shields is the producer in this film. Mark Hedgecoe is the executive producer. And we are a team of 3 with Hazel, you know. And we have another person that comes on board when we're filming. So we're quite a small unit.
All but Mikey.
And my theorist's point was, what could we do that was going to be any different from what's already been portrayed? And if we're just dredging up a story, which is about a brutal murder of a person who didn't deserve to die by a person who says he maintains his innocence, what good are we doing if we're just going to do that? Are we re-traumatizing a family and a community? And what we agreed as a team, Hazel, Leslie, Mark, and myself, as we said, this can only exist really if we can do something that the other films haven't been able to do. Can we get an access that no one else has had to do in TV? I don't know what it's like in podcasting, but we call it a 360-degree access. So it means what it is. You could turn around and you could look at it. And that's what we set out to try to achieve. That was quite difficult. Leslie is fairly tenacious as a producer. And I think between the 3 of us, that became quite a strong kind of vehicle to try to get people on board, because we've got people on both sides of the table. People who believe Michael Ross is guilty, people who believe Michael Ross is innocent. We'd have loved a bit more people who believed Michael Ross was guilty, because I think that the scales tipped a wee bit too much. And that was just to do with some people who end up saying no to us when we were filming. But the desire was there. And the desire was to find Shamsuddin's family. But in every film I've done, we always have luck and we have unlucky moments as well.
It was kind of swayed more towards not guilty, but because of George Thompson at the end, it kind of threw you back the other way as well with what he said. But I'll come to that. I'm jumping ahead. So I'm just thinking, that kind of helped balance it a little bit, didn't it? That was a bit of a wow moment.
And you got to remember that when we're filming, so we have that in our arsenal, and we were in an edit process, and we were running 3 edits at the same time. Myself, I've got 2 amazing film editors. So we were still filming, they were editing, and then we could see the George Thompson moment. So we could begin to plot, because obviously George Thompson was completely unplanned for. Nobody knew what George was going to say. But you can hear my voice go up an octave. I feel like a 13-year-old boy again. My voice isn't quite broken. I'm quite unsure what's happening. That's a power documentary.
Yeah, that was powerful stuff, that one. But yes, I'll come to that. So yes, I was going to, as you mentioned there, that there was some people that you obviously said no. Who were you wanting to speak to?
We were trying to strike a balance, and also trying to find the right people that can bring something to parts of the film that haven't been explored. The acting SIO, Senior Investigating Officer Angus Chisholm, has talked quite a few times. I think this was a more in-depth talk than he was used to, but we would have liked some other people. But, he gives really good sense of his investigation. And so we're lucky with the people we've got. We had David Mateer, who's a detective sergeant, who talks about, as Hazel said, this was like a gangster movie, the kind of crime scene, just that kind of the visceralness. And this is the guy that's been involved in other murders outside the island when he worked elsewhere in Scotland. So many people in Orkney, many cops had never been involved in any murders.
Stephen, can you tell us a bit about how the Man in the Mask documentary was arranged and how it was made? And just tell us a little bit about the interview process.
So in most films, Hazel, being a reporter and our kind of like front of house for the audience to understand this case, would be speaking to contributors. In this series, she doesn't speak to contributors, but it's for a good reason. It's because what we wanted to do is create a kind of like a clean slate. We had 1,000 documents that had never been seen by any one programme. And there has been quite a lot of programmes, as I mentioned. No one else has had 1,000 different unreported documents, witness statements, internal reports, even Michael Ross's army records. These had never been seen before. So we had this treasure trove of things. What we wanted to do is try to make sure that Hazel was as clean a slate as possible, that she didn't go in knowing what it was like to be in someone's house and get to have tea and coffee with them. That's my job. So I interviewed them with Leslie Shields, the producer. And we then brought it together. So then Hazel, when she's in her office space looking at things, she can look at their interview, she can look at the paperwork and start making her own kind of judgments. And that way preserves Hazel, because she's also her own journalist. I'm not a journalist, I'm a documentary maker. But Hazel is able to then look at everything in a whole. She came before filming up into Orkney. We did some filming with her to set the scene, just to get a feel for the area. And then we did some filming in the middle of things. But that meant that she was able to then look at our contributor mix, look at what they say, and be able to begin to analyse that in a way.
So you had access, Hazel, to you kind of read everything ahead of time. So you were You weren't just prompted, you actually knew what was coming and such like.
I knew it was coming, but then I kind of found out along the way, just as I said, the ins and outs of everything and the documents and things like that. So I was kind of finding it out, not at the time, that the audience does, but along the way, like the audience does, if that makes sense. So you commented before, Dawn, about how my expressions are a very expressionate face, but yeah, a lot of them were, that was me expressing how I felt. So,
and a lot of contributors come in midway journey, so we're still getting access even though we're filming, and that's just the realities of present day timeframes, and I was even filming during the edit, which is crazy because we were running 3 films at the same time, so it's a busy space.
All right then, so let's talk about Robert Smith. In episode 1, he came on and said that he saw a suspicious-looking man at the Mumtaz restaurant side door, and he was convinced that was the killer 2 hours before the shooting. When you spoke to him, why was he convinced? Because, like I said, it was 2 hours before. He thought he was acting suspiciously, but he didn't have a gun. Why him and not Michael? Was there something there?
So Robert Smith never thought that was the killer, because you said he didn't have a gun on him. What he said was that this person was acting really strange 2 hours before the murder. When he saw him acting strange, he had a very visceral feeling that he felt like he was a bit shaken. Robert Smith, I'm a small guy. Robert Smith is roughly the height of me. I'm just over 5'5". Robert Smith is just a bit smaller than me. This guy was about a 6-foot guy, kind of bodybuilder in shape, and gave him the chills. Now, he said it looked like when he saw him walking down, they were walking down opposite sides of the street, the small pit of Kirkwall. He thought that guy looked like he wanted to do harm to someone. That's the kind of feeling he had at the time. He then goes into an entrance. At that point, Robert Smith was living in a different island. He was just delivering eggs. He seems to have a bit of an odd job kind of thing. But he didn't know that was an Indian restaurant. So when he walked down that lane goes from where a fish and chip shop is and the car park, one of the main car parks. So that's where he was going.
Right.
And he never knew that side entrance was he obviously knew the Mumtaz was at that point, bright pink. He knew that was the restaurant, but he didn't know that was the side entrance door. So he sees the guy 2 hours before the murder. A day later, he hears about the murder because he's back on his other island, which I can't remember which island is offhand. And obviously, word is sweeping around the islands there has been a murder. The first murder, as Hazel said, for 25 years, for a generation. And then he phones the police. And that's when he's going, this is important because you've got a guy acting really strange, making him have the chills. And it's quite a visceral reaction. What you don't see in the final film is actually Robert having a breakdown.
Oh.
Because he remembers it. We take him right into that zone and he breaks down crying on the camera.
Oh my gosh.
Because he feels like he somehow hasn't done enough his side.
Oh, that's heartbreaking, yeah.
So it's not that he saw the killer. He saw somebody that he believed actually on reflection that the guy should be investigated. Now, when you actually look at, Hazel talked about 13 witnesses in the restaurant, plus number 14, Marion, who worked in the restaurant with Shamsuddin, and she was a server. They all had different heights of the people. And the heights of the killer in the balaclava, who walked in calmly, a cool cam collected, as Hazel said, was between 5'5"-ish, 5'7"-ish, to over 6'1". And there's 9 people outside the restaurant that see him, and he's running, or they saw him before what we think now was the time of the killing. They all have a slightly different height range. Really, if someone pointed a gun in your face, Dawn, I think you see the gun.
Yep.
You're not really picking up. You've seen a balaclava and a gun, and you're hoping that your loved one or you are not going to get hurt. So Robert didn't know any of that.
Right.
Because he wasn't part of that. He just saw someone acting strange.
Hearing that, I mean, I was already had a bit of questions about DI Angus Chisholm's, the way he kind of responded to Robert Smith's statement. I mean, I've spoken to a couple of family members of victims who are still unsolved, and they're desperate for anybody to come forward with any bit of information. It's all relevant, it's all been looked into, and I found it a bit jarring, the way he kind of was dismissing Robert, and especially, I mean, now knowing what he was feeling and how it was his gut reaction and how it made him feel to just investigate it. That was my impression of him. But what was he really like? Was he as dismissive of that?
I don't think he's dismissive of Robert as a person. What he feels is that wasn't the guy. I think that's what he's dismissing. And, this is a guy that is, the police are being flooded with kind of like lots of comments. I think they did 3,200 witness statements. I think they did something like 6,000 different either door knocks or kind of like looking at, speaking to various people phoning up it was a kind of like they were being swarmed at a time when the police computing system really wasn't in what we think now. So they were trying to do the best with quite a small bunch of officers, quite a small, and a lot of out-towners. And obviously, as the investigation went on, they got lesser and lesser members of staff that could, police force that could be on this case. But I think for Angus, the sort of sidebar to this story is Angus then does an ID parade, or his colleagues do an ID parade, and Robert's brought in amongst other people who are witnesses as well. And no one ever points to Michael Ross in that ID parade.
I understand why you left that in, because it was making the point that he was very focused right from the get-go on Michael, and that's why this doesn't fit that narrative. So it was just, that's not important.
I think where we felt was incredible is the murders in June 1994. The EFIT is in, I think it's late June 1994. It's maybe 2 weeks after the murder. But the EFIT's not released until Crime Watch in October 1994.
Right.
I think that's very strange. And when Hazel and I and Leslie were looking at it, we found a tiny wee... This wasn't really picked up by the mainstream press in mainland UK. It was in Orkney. Obviously, it was the biggest case in the local papers. But we found a tiny wee note in one of the local papers, the Orcadian, I think it was the Orcadian, that one of the other senior investigators said that the reason why they didn't release this EFIT was because at the time, back in June, which is where I would think personally you would release it. But the reason why they didn't release it then is because they didn't want to overwhelm and create more anxiety within the community. My position would be, I think that community was already anxious. It was already, the first three days after the murder, the whole paper in the Orcadian was taken with this case. You can't deny that because it was the first murder in 25 years. It shocked the community. But do you remember at Hazel when we found this tiny wee note and they were saying they didn't want to create anxiety and that's why we delayed it for 3 months? And I find that is very, very curious.
I would say, yeah, curious is the right word for it, isn't it? I think it doesn't add up to say that, does it? I did find that very strange, and more so that it was a little tiny kind of afterthought. Like you're saying, Stephen, I think that it was such a shocking crime, and that radiates to this day. I have colleagues up in Orkney talking about what happened because they're local to there and have been there for their whole lives, saying things like, I remember exactly where I was when it happened. I remember viscerally remember what the events were, and everyone was talking about it. Yeah, this was a story that wasn't going away. So if you're thinking about how shocked people were, how the heat was on to catch the person that did this, I guess why wouldn't you release that EFIT the second that you had it?
It's easy to look at things with the benefit of hindsight, because we'd say that doesn't make sense. What we're not in is a very busy, overwhelmed, undermanned, under-resourced crime scene. We're not in a community that's really nervous, really scared, and local policing is trying to take account of their fears. We're not in a community where the schools are frightened. We're not in a community where other people, like the owner of the Moomtaz, put his family into hiding.
Oh.
Because there's not many people of colour in Orkney even to this day, but there was certainly a lot less back in 1994. So right away, he's beginning to go, are we all at threat here? Is it people of colour, people who are brown, people who are black? Are we going to be next? I think maybe that's the way to put it. And so everyone was frightened. And you have a police force who's quite small, trying to cover a massive area, who's quite literally under-resourced, overwhelmed, and trying to do the best they can. So I think personally, I think what Hazel was saying, her personal point of view, it would seem incredulous not to release this EFIT earlier. It's one of the curiosities of this. Why wait to Crime Watch?
Mm.
But they did that and they made that decision, and we can't really understand that decision. The team can't understand it.
Talking about the investigation and not following things up, there was a sighting of Shamsuddin outside the restaurant having an argument with two men 2 days before the murder. Can you tell us about that? Those two men weren't traced, were they?
What's particular about that is two Austrian tourists are having a curry at midnight. I have no idea why anyone eats a curry or eats any food at midnight, but they were.
More like a snack.
No. And someone comes to the door and is threatening Shamsuddin Mahmood. But not only that is he threatening, he says, "I'll shoot you,"
Oh, right, okay.
2 or 3 times. Those Austrian tourists were so scared, they went back to the guest house. They told the person who ran the guest house, and then they went back home. They were so frightened they wouldn't even return back to the UK to give evidence when the police wanted them. So you would have to say, and this is where the craziness of Crime Watch is. It talks about this. You couldn't be more clear. This is a person of colour who's a waiter who is shot dead in a restaurant while serving other people. Shot dead. 2 days before, someone says, "I'm going to shoot you 2 times." Or maybe it's thrice, but it was that kind of level. You couldn't be more clear. There's such a comparison between those two. And that has never been followed up. And I think Ethan Flett, who's a reporter for the Orkney, does a phenomenal job. He's young, so he wasn't there at the time back in 94. He's only been there for sort of 2.5 odd years. But he finds it incredible, and he's had quite a forensic look at this case, that something so exacting as that was never run with by the police.
Yeah, I found that as well. Never.
It just disappears.
Right.
And to me, that's such a standout line of inquiry. No, I'm not a police officer. I'm not a detective, in that way. But when you lay out those 2 facts, I think that to hear that it wasn't, or to learn that it wasn't followed up, is really, really peculiar. But yeah, like Stephen says, that was kind of the end of it.
You ask why this film should happen? Because this film is hopefully, listen, we can't do every thread, but when Hazel came to the office and we started talking about this project, we all talked about, let's go down all these bits that everyone else is, because of speed and time and their pressures of time constraint of how long they're filming this. We've made the longest series in terms of screen minutes that's been done in this case.
Mm-hmm. Deep dive.
We were all very much a deep dive. And the desire was to go down all these little rabbit holes and go, okay, let's try and ask about that. Let's try and ask that. And that's the importance of this. And we'll get things as much right as we get wrong. But when Hazel came into the office and we started talking about this project, we were all like, okay, we're going to go for it. Let's go for it. Let's get as many contributors as we can that haven't been talked before. Let's go down all these little curiosities. And I have a very crass analogy in this film. People talk about the JFK moment. Where were you when JFK got killed? Now, this isn't the JFK film. But there's a reason, there is a similarity. There's a reason why people talk about JFK continually, because something doesn't make sense. The reason why there's been so many films about this and now a podcast, and there's lots of people write it and continue to write about it, not least because Michael tries to escape quite a lot of times, is because something doesn't make sense. And someone who says, 2 witnesses from Austria that say, I heard someone at midnight coming in the door shouting and screaming, "I'm going to shoot you," 2 times to Shamsuddin Mahmood, who was 2 days later shot.
Yeah.
For that not to be really run with by the police and not thoroughly investigated, that feels to me wrong.
It does.
Or the word we have to use, curious.
Yeah, okay, curious, yeah, strange. So when you were speaking to everybody that you did speak to, was it just for them to tell their story, or were you able to ask questions? Could you ask, like, for example, here we go again, D.I. Chisholm, could you ask why did he not go down that road? Or...
Yeah, no, we asked lots of...
There's so much to it. I think that's it. There's so many different threads. There's so many different documents and reports and everything that you're uncovered, that you're also, a lot of it, seeing it for the first time. You're so fully embedded in it. I think it's quite difficult to retain everything at once.
But Angus Chisholm, he was leading the investigation. So lots of inputs are coming in at the time. I don't think Angus Chisholm really remembers too much about what happened with Robert Smith. And I don't think Angus Chisholm really remembers too much about the investigation of what happened 2 days before. And I think that's because, in reality, it was never pulled apart by the police. It was never thoroughly investigated. We will never know the truth in this one. But the fact that even Ethan Flett, the journalist in the Orkney, and the Orkney are the local paper in Orkney and doing the most work in this case, the fact that he can't even find out where this goes, this 2 days before, quite simple, I'm going to shoot you, and it doesn't get looked at by police.
Yeah. Even if it was just something somebody says and didn't actually mean anything, they were arguing about something, it was about something, so it would be good to just, put that to bed. Was that anything to do with the murder?
And I think that's why the community today is still divided. Because people will look at that and go, hang on a second, that doesn't make sense. Robert Smith says he saw a guy who was 6 foot bodybuilder. Michael Ross is not 6 foot bodybuilder.
Yeah.
He's sort of 5'7" And I think that's one of the reasons why people today are still interested in this case, why it still becomes news, why the reason that Hazel Mark Hedgecoe, the exec producer, and Leslie and I made this film.
And you mentioned there about the locals. Did you speak to any locals? Maybe they didn't appear on the show, but just when you were there, did you have a chance to speak to them about it? What was the...
Tons.
Oh, right, okay.
Tons.
So what was the consensus? What was their thoughts?
I'd say there's definitely a sense of when we were there, because we were there filming outside a lot, and people are naturally curious about what you're doing there with 2 cameras and all this. Even though there were just 4 of us, it's still an unusual sight, isn't it? So you could feel how I think this case has impacted people in Orkney because of the reaction of the people that just approached us and asked what we were doing. They kind of almost knew why you were there before you said anything. And there wasn't anything hostile in it. Everyone was lovely, really friendly. It was a really nice community feel. But you could just get a sense of, all right, okay. I think the chat about it being such a divided subject, I think, was really palpable. And the people that I remember hearing from, nobody was kind of quick to give you an answer about what they believed. So it was an interesting, I guess, situation to be in where it said a lot, but not a lot at the same time.
Every film I've ever made where you have a divide or a division between someone's guilt or not guilt, you always find that the people, in my experience, the people who want to talk are people who don't believe it, and the people who don't want to talk are people who just want to let it go. It's been settled. And I would say that remains true in this film. People who believe in Michael's guilt and people who believe in Michael's innocence gave us a time of day and were very flexible to us. It's a small island. They knew exactly what we were doing. And no one gave us any hassle, actually, which is quite something on such a divided issue.
Yeah. And it's daunting, personally going into that situation, in this, but not just in that, I'm a journalist. I go into situations all the time where people probably would rather I wasn't there. You've got to do your job. But yeah, there was a sense I felt of people are just, it's been decades now, people are still talking about it. There is a sense, the kind of heaviness that hangs there, which was interesting.
Did what you found out of what was said kind of make you think one way or the other about Michael's guilt then? Did it help you?
Yeah, because I would say that I have arrived at a conclusion, but it's not a conclusion, in that I don't think that I can land firmly in any camp. And that's just because there's just so much to it, and there are unbelievable things that happen, but there are so many different avenues, and I think it's really difficult to kind of, like I said, land in one camp or the other. I think there are arguments for and arguments against, and really strong opinions on one side and really strong opinions on the other side. And with that, having looked at it all, having read it all, having, spoken to people, albeit not interviewing the interviewees themselves, but looking at that, analysing it all, I do unfortunately think it's really difficult to call, and I don't think that we will ever have an answer. But I think that goes back to why people are interested in this story, and why, as Stephen mentioned, there has been so many films made about it, and we really gave it a good go, and we got further than anybody, I think, that Stephen was saying, in terms of kind of what we were able to obtain and go through.
From watching the programme, I feel the same. It's hard to know one way or the other. So can I ask you, because you've looked at all the court transcripts and such like that, how do you think the jury came to the decision? What was in there that would have made them think, right, I think he's guilty?
See, before I did this kind of thing, I used to think, I would say I am kind of singular in my thoughts. You're either guilty or not guilty. And if you're guilty, hell mend you. And if you're not guilty, then you should be let out. I'm not a flexitarian in guilt whatsoever. What I've since learned is actually the person who the QC or a KC nowadays, the lead barrister, the person who tells the best story is the person who ends up winning the case. And my personal belief would be that I think Brian McConaughey told the best story and the most convincing story. And he told a story that was pretty hard to come up against. This is a circumstantial case. There's no DNA. There's no gun ever found. There's no evidence that links Shamsuddin Mahmood with Michael Ross. So the only thing is, as what Hazel says, is one particular bullet casing, and even that was contaminated. So there was no DNA in that singular bullet. So obviously you would think you would see it being chambered. So that'd be a thumbprint on the back of a bullet or on the top of a bullet as you push it down into the chamber. Because of sooting, there doesn't seem to be any fingerprint or any DNA on that bullet. So it's a circumstantial case. So both defence and prosecution can only argue from that point of view. They can only say, we think it's Michael Ross because of X. We don't think it's Michael Ross because of X. And I think the person who told the best story was the prosecution, the Crown. And they told a compelling story and a narrative which swayed the jury. We weren't in the jury. And I think what they managed to do is tell something that felt very believable to the jury.
All right, interesting. So, Hazel, you mentioned in the documentary about how it could perhaps have been a contract killer who'd been involved in Shamsuddin's murder, and the fact that the police hadn't covered all of the ports and didn't have a grasp of exactly who was coming and going from the island at the time of Shamsuddin's murder. Do you think that all the sightings and information could have perhaps just been noise, and that a contract killer could have somehow slipped on and off the island undetected?
I am, first and foremost, I'm a journalist, so I would never really put my opinion on, but what I can say is that it was a line of inquiry that was pursued, and it was our duty and our obligation to look into that, I think. So we weren't necessarily endorsing that theory that this was a contract killing, but it was something that was looked at. And, there were similarities between where Shamil has lived previously and where this other contract killing had happened. There were similarities and there were coincidences. So, and again, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but at the time it was in the news that this is something that had happened and there had been a rising just around the UK. So, it wasn't us, or wasn't me certainly thinking that this is what I think happened. But again, it was one of the twists of this case, which is already so bizarre. There are already so many different layers to it, as Stephen had said. So it was something else that we had to look into.
Another theory, yeah.
Yeah.
Stephen, what's your thoughts on the theory of a contract killer being involved in Shamsuddin's murder?
So we just forget the two guys in Kent just now for 1 second. If we just look at it as a proposition of a hit person, we know that a person walked into a restaurant with other diners, calm, collected, no hesitation. They were in a balaclava. They walk up to Shamsuddin and he shoots him in the eye. It's the closest, in point blank range, it's the closest form of execution you can have. Quite often the hitmen or hit people these days, because there's a lot of female hit women coming into the scene, quite often they'll turn the victim around. And that's so you have a plausible deniability, so that you could say that your actions didn't kill this person. You didn't see their eyes, the whites of the eyes. You didn't see the urine stench. You didn't see the fear in the person. So that didn't happen. In this person, the hitman, because we know it's male from the witness statements, went up to Shamsuddin and shot him in the eye. So that hitman looked at Shamsuddin at the point of execution. We know that person left the building, didn't leave any evidence whatsoever, didn't leave a gun. We also know that Shamsuddin was a Bangladeshi native, and the only bullet in this case, the casing, was from an arsenal made in India. So there is quite a good report, an interesting report, that suggests they wonder whether, and many theories came from police investigation, we could see, was this an honour killing? Was this for some other reason, So if we take the two Charlie guys away who were connected to this case and have since been discounted, there's lots of different things that people can say about this execution that would give you pause for thought that actually it could have been a hitman. And I think a lot of people still to this day believe it still could be, What we're saying in this one is like Michael Ross was 15-year-old schoolboy. Now, I'm not talking about just whether he was guilty or not. What I'm trying to say is if we look at it, this is a first-time killing in a restaurant full of people. This is not killing at nighttime or in the woods or somewhere private. This is a public execution. So it's akin, in my mind, going from 0 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour as a first-time kill, if it is a first-time kill. Because if Michael Ross did it, that was a first-time kill as far as we can understand. And he would have been 15 at that point. That is going literally from 0 to 100 miles an hour within that 20 seconds as he walks through. I don't even think it's 20 seconds. I think because the actual restaurant's quite small. So it's like a 5-second walk in, no hesitation shooting. So I think that's the reason why many people still think it could be a hitman. There were some weird characters in the island around that time. There's some people that talk about a nightclub and some weird people in a nightclub. Because obviously this is a small community, they know out-of-towners. Now they could just be tourists coming in the ships and the cruises, or they could be something connected. Shamsuddin Mahmood, as Hazel says really well in the film, worked in Kent, which is not that far from where the Chorley guys were living, right? It'd be akin to travelling up to Edinburgh, from Glasgow to Edinburgh, where he was living. So that's going to be quite compelling. So I think that's why the reasons why the hitman story, hitman theory still exists.
But then also, isn't it, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but for people, for those who believe, or for some of those who believe that Michael Ross isn't guilty, think that, well, if he didn't do it, then who else could have done it? So that is a factor as well, I think.
It's a central problem with this case. There's never been a who else. If it wasn't Michael Ross, who was it? And they've never, ever been able to square that off. And I think Michael Ross trying to escape later with armaments in the back of the car, for whatever reason that may be. I think that's deeply problematic. And to many people, that sort of gives them a feeling that he was guilty because he had the wherewithal and the mindset to hire a car, put munitions into a car and stuff like that. Michael Ross was maintained that was for a reason. He was going to escape to the Highlands. Many people would find that difficult. I think D.I. Angus Chisholm finds it very difficult to this day. I think Hazel and I and Leslie find it problematic.
Yeah.
Two of us, all three of us, we probably had different views on it, though. Whether that was an admission of guilt or whether that was a sign of guilt or not.
I think for those who were on the fence about Michael Ross's guilt, I think that then made the decision for them because it is just an utterly bizarre, unbelievable thing to happen. That happened.
Yeah, the car's one thing, but to have the amount of bullets or the amount of ammunition he had as well, it's like that. I did agree with D.I. Chisholm. It's like, that's not going to end well, whatever he was thinking there. So I get that he went a bit too far.
Thing is that I've never heard of machine pistol. I've only heard of machine guns. So that's just because I'm innocent when it comes to hardware. But the machine pistol was smuggled in the back of a TV from Kosovo when Michael Ross was serving over there. So again, you'd say to detractors, they would say, hang on a second, they're showing us there's sort of a sign of someone who's intent on bringing this back.
Talking about guns, what was your impressions of Eddie when you spoke to him, obviously, because he bought his son guns?
Gun, single.
Gun. Oily bought his...
And it was a decommissioned gun, I think is quite important.
Yeah, so it was like a lump of metal.
Can you tell us a bit more about the Ross family's background with the military and their history with weaponry?
This family, the Ross family, were a military-loving family. Eddie Ross was Black Watch, amongst other units. Michael Ross was Black Watch, and then his brother was in the Marines. They're an army-loving household and avid interest in guns and warfare and tanks and so on. Eddie Ross bought his son one deactivated machine gun, and that hung above his wall like a trophy. But that is in keeping with that family. As far as we understand, is only the mum doesn't like that kind of things. But they loved that. The three guys in that household loved that world. So I think that's fine. The dad was also a firearms officer and involved in cadets and involved in learning cadets how to shoot as well as how to do mountaineering. So it's not all about guns. They did have an enormous amount. The important thing for your listeners, though, is we were talking about a 9mm gun that executed Shamsuddin Mahmood. All 9mm guns on the island were checked. And all 9mm guns that Eddie Ross had in his house when the house was searched were checked. At that point, they were checked by Eddie Ross and one other person, because at that point, Eddie Ross wasn't under suspicion. And then when Eddie Ross became under suspicion, they were checked for a second time. And none of those 9mm guns within Eddie Ross' household were connected to the crime. Every one of your listeners will understand that you can tell the gun from the bullet, how it's chambered and so on. You can look at a bullet. The experts can. I can't even explain it properly, but the experts can check a bullet to the gun and match them. There was no matching of that bullet casing to any guns that Eddie Ross had in that family.
And were all the guns accounted for that they had bought over periods of time, or Eddie had?
Yeah, and they're all licensed as well.
Okay.
So they weren't unlicensed. Now, there's a wee bit of a sidebar that there was a couple of other unlicensed grey guns in the island. There were 3 unlicensed grey guns at the time, I bet it was far more because of the community and its history and the war and the World War II and so on. And we had lots of scuttling of military boats, of boats during World War II. So we have evidence that there was 3 grey guns in the island. Eddie Ross had one of them. These were guns that are used, what we understand is they were used for parts. So you might use, bits of the gun for other things, So that is a bit problematic, but again, that wasn't connected to the gun, to the bullet casing that killed Shamsuddin Mahmood.
Okay, then. And then, obviously, the bullets, the 9mm Turkey bullets, ammunition that Eddie came forward with after 2 months. So what impression did you get from him? Did you get the impression at all that it was a calculated decision? Or do you think thought he would be protected by the family, the police family, that it would be okay, it was the right thing to do?
The case of the bullets is really difficult because it is like a swamp to get into this one, because it's fairly challenging insofar that...
So many facts. There's so many.
Okay, well, let's start with where these particular bullets came from. Eddie got them from James Spence, didn't he? Who was James Spence?
James Spence was an ex-Marine, and then he worked as a street sweeper. He's now since passed away. James Spence gave bullets to Eddie Ross about somewhere, it's a bit vague, but somewhere like 6 to 10 years before the killing. And there's a debate of how many bullets he gives Eddie Ross. So we're only interested in 9mm bullets, but there was also a thing called .22 bullets, which is a different caliber entirely. But we have a dispute on how many bullets he gave. So Eddie Ross, in the murders in June 94, Eddie Ross comes in August 94, and he tells the police, and he says, I have some of these bullets. Now, Eddie Ross is the person who identified the bullet and the casing, and he said, this is from this rare thing called the Kirky arsenal in India. And that was because he was a gun fan, and it was had his all his reference books. He was a firearms officer of Orkney, so it was his jurisdiction, if you like. He says he was asked into the crime scene and then asked to look at the bullet. People during the trial said, no, that's not the case, that he tried to barge in to the crime scene.
Oh, right.
And this all plays down to whether Eddie Ross is complicit or not complicit. And that's where the audiences and the viewers and the listeners will try to work it out. Eddie Ross then says in August 94, he was given 3 boxes by James Spence. That is a sealed box of 9mm, an open box of .22, and a sealed box of .22. James Spence is then asked by police, and he says, no, I just gave him a sealed box of 9mm and an open box of .22.
Okay.
So that's 3 from Eddie Ross and 2 from James Spence. So that doesn't add up. Someone's making a mistake there, either making a mistake or lying or whatever it might be. 6 months after the murder, in December, James Spence is re-interviewed by police. So you have to ask a question of why there's these delays. If someone tells you in August that he gave me 3 bullets, 3 boxes, and he gave me 2 boxes, and then you wait for another couple of months, personally, I find that a bit difficult. And I did ask about that, but there was no real answer for it. 6 months after the murder, James Spence then says, no. I actually gave him a sealed box of 9mm and an open box of 9mm.
Right. Okay.
And a box of .22. Now, Eddie Ross, then the police go to his house, and you've seen in the film, but Angus Chisholm was quite perplexed by this. Why did you not tell us? If you knew you had one of these precise bullets, why did you not tell us? No real answer for that. Eddie Ross would say, I thought I was doing the police a favour. And his answer to that is, and I can see his point of view, that many of us in our house don't know exactly what's in our house.
Yeah.
Have you got 2 boxes of Weetabix or half a box of Weetabix or whatever, right? I'm not sure I totally subscribe to that view, because we're talking about bullets here with a firearms officer, and we're talking about bullets being in a bullet safe and guns being in a gun safe. And he was very strict in that sort of stuff. I have a feeling I would remember that if I was in his world. I remember all my camera equipment, what I have, because that's my baby. I would have thought he did, but he maintains he didn't. So you have this dispute that's happening within the 3 boxes or 2 boxes. When the police come, they only find 1 sealed box of 9mm, and it's 9mm we're interested for a story. So that means that there's an open box of 9mm, which James Spence says he gave him.
Yep.
And if it was an open box of that 9mm, that meant Michael Ross could have used that bullet. But if there was no open box of 9mm, and there was only 1 box of sealed 9mm, then there's no case to answer. And that's the conundrum the police found himself in. If you're looking at it from different points of view, you would say either Eddie Ross is playing a 3D jigsaw and he's getting ahead of the story, or he's totally legit. Where I struggle in this story is murders in June 94, the revelation to the police about the bullets in August 94. But in July 94, we now have evidence that James Spence was spoken to by Eddie Ross about those bullets. So Eddie Ross did know about those bullets in July 94. Now, he maintains that actually he wasn't saying, you better not tell the police. He maintains it was just about talking about the bullets you gave me were the 9mm. But something doesn't, it was one of those moments when we came across this document, and I'll remember this moment because I've got goosebumps just now. And it was Leslie Shields, our amazing producer. We were both sitting together in the office, and she handed me this moment. I don't know where you are in swearing, but she says, holy fuck.
Yeah.
And she handed me this document, and it was about the July conversation between James Spence and Eddie Ross. Now, we don't know what they said because it's just a memory, you know? But it's curious.
So who said that they had the phone call about these 9mm? Was it James or was it?
It wasn't a phone call, it was a meeting in person.
Oh, it was a meeting in person.
Yeah.
Oh, so Eddie admitted to that as well?
Yeah.
But it didn't come forward until August. Holy shit.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I think it's quite difficult. Now, let me just tell you where we're at with that story. The people who believe Michael Ross is guilty would latch onto that, and say, this is completely wrong. Eddie Ross knew he had those bullets, and that open box that James Spence may have given him of the open box of 9mm might have been used for a crime. The people who believe in Eddie Ross's and Michael Ross's innocence would say that it's just circumstantial, that never happened, that they've only got a sealed box, because a sealed box was sealed. Now, I can see in statements from Angus Chisholm that Angus Chisholm personally opened the box because it's sealed in clear plastic, and he had to open the box. The reality of when Hazel and I made the documentary, we went into the story far more because you could see pressure being put on James Spence, which was immense from the police investigation. Because James Spence, do you remember that unfortunately this didn't make the cut because we ran out of screen time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you remember, there was pressure being put on James Spence because he effectively had given the family the bullets, which may or may not have killed Shamsuddin. And that's a heavy cross to bear.
Yeah.
And if he did supply the bullets, however inadvertently, and James Spence would be right to give it to a firearms officer to dispose of, and it was 6 or 10 years before the murder, so there was no badness in what James Spence was doing. You would say, I'm a street sweeper now, I used to be a Marine, he was friends with Eddie Ross. You would say that's a good thing to do, go and give it to the local firearms officer in a community that was small like Kirkwall. I think that there's no badness in there. But if he did have the bullets that killed Shamsuddin and it's an if, then he was looking at jail time too, because he stole those bullets. And that's part of the story I haven't also said. When you leave a gun range in the military, you have to say that you do not have any bullets on you.
Okay.
So you give an oath, which is like a promise. It's not like a pinky promise, it's like a real promise, because bullets kill. And we see that in this story. So James Spence, whenever he left the gun range, had to give an oath that he did not have any bullets. But he was also the bullet master in the Marines. And he stole 2 packs of bullets or 3 packs of bullets, we don't even know. So that theft, that original theft, if that had a snakes and ladders all the way up to Shamsuddin's death, then he was culpable and could have served jail time. So the pressure on James Spence was huge.
My God, yeah.
So the question you have to ask, was the pressure on James Spence so much so that he lied to get the police off his back? Or was Eddie Ross guilty? Eddie Ross would say he wasn't. James Spence is now dead. So all we can go on is it's a kind of, again, I'll use this word because we kind of love it in this series, is to use it's curious, because we can't find a way, an answer to it. All we can look at is the evidence. And I remember Hazel being in the office when we found all this stuff, and her sort of jaw-dropping like that when you look at the pressure being put down on James Spence.
Christ.
Yeah.
God, it's a shame that it didn't make the cut, because that's shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. Sometimes you squeeze things down so much, and this point, that story became so big. I think that story in the end was like 5 minutes odd in the cut.
But it's a lot.
And it became such a detour, and we would have loved to have James Spence. Obviously, he's passed away, but it became difficult, and after a while, it just got distracting. But to answer that last question, I do not think Eddie Ross believed that the police family would make him safe.
Really?
I don't think that entered into his mindset. I think Eddie Ross is a kind of white and black kind of guy. Whether Eddie Ross is guilty or not guilty, I'm not sure. But he maintained that he thought he was doing the right thing.
Right.
And I think many people used to think of Eddie Ross being quite a straight cop when he was on the streets. You know, he did a lot of community policing, that kind of thing. I thought he was quite a kind of straight cop in that respect. Who knows? Who knows? Because I just wasn't there. And the community is very divided on the Ross family because of the murder.
So somebody that thinks that Michael's innocent, Karen, can you talk a little bit about her? Because, you know, she's just so sure that he is innocent and she's behind him. Is there anything, there's nothing that makes her think, oh, I'm not sure about that, but there's this, she's just definitely coming down on the side of him being innocent. And why? I mean, what's she got?
I don't think Karen gives an answer about what she thinks at all. I think she's just kind of looked at all the evidence. Am I right?
Yeah, so Karen's mother was the boss of Michael Ross's mum, Moira.
Right, okay.
When they worked in the Macmillan Cancer. And one day, Karen comes home and sees her mum upset because the Ross family are being embroiled into this. And obviously, it's the talk of the community. Karen, I think she's an amazing person insofar that she's someone who's got all this evidence and looked at it and got herself deeper and deeper into the story and wanting to be part of it. When she saw the Crime Watch, which was massive, in October 94, so what's that, a few months after the murder, and she saw the fact that 2 days before, Shamsuddin Mahmood was being threatened, I'll kill you. And she saw different things in that Crime Watch that never made it to trial. Up to that point, before the trial, she just thought that things would come out that nobody ever knew about, that the police would find all the evidence and they would suddenly reveal their hand. And when she started collecting the newspapers, she began to realise that the case felt in her mind quite flawed and one-dimensional. It wasn't going into all these other things. It wasn't investigating properly this idea that there was a really clear threat to Shamsuddin 2 days before the murder. You know, there's nothing uncertain about I'll shoot you when a guy's shot 2 days later. So things like that didn't make sense to her, and she began to investigate. But she did the old cell investigation, which is get your hands dirty with paperwork. She got as much paperwork as she could find. She found every newspaper cutting that she could find. She found all the files that she could amass and started speaking to people and gradually amass a huge treasure trove of documents. And I think that's her problem. So she's not looking at it from a wee woman, Chad, make her own name. That's not what she comes from. If anything, she's scared by that. What she's trying to do is being really quite cool and examine factually the evidence and go, this doesn't make sense. She's arrived at the position that Michael Ross is innocent, but even herself would say that if Michael Ross is guilty, then he'll mend him. She believes he's innocent based upon the facts that she's been able to find, and she's found a phenomenal amount of facts that even the police don't seem to find. She was the one that found the hitman story, for instance.
Okay.
Or what one of her team did, right? The links, because the hitman story involved someone being taken away, a balaclava, which was quite rare at that sort of time, right? She was the one that found the commonality of other hits within the UK at that point. It was a bit of a crime spree. I think she's an amazing woman because she is factual. She looks at the story and she tries to break it down and go, this is wrong, this wasn't looked at, why wasn't this looked at? She also finds the fact that Michael Ross tried to escape and with the munitions in the back of the car problematic to her. She finds it deeply problematic. And I think that shows the character of Karen in my mind, that she isn't blindsided by a singular, he's just innocent. She believes in his innocence, certainly. But what she doesn't do is come out from like a fanboy or fangirl kind of point of view. She doesn't come across that way. She's come out based upon evidence from a wee girl who grew up reading Nancy Drew, loving that world and wanting to try to solve things. And this was the biggest thing to solve on her island.
So the next thing I want to talk about is the racism angle. So it's, D.I. Chisholm had didn't think it was anything to do with racism. A new detective comes in, has fresh eyes, and he sees the workings in, or the doodlings in the notebook is a problem. But it goes a little bit further, doesn't it? You also find a couple of witness statements that were quite damning. And I can see a change in you in the episode there as well. How soon did you find that out? And was it difficult to carry on being impartial after you found that out?
It's an uncomfortable one actually as well, because it's such a horrendous thing, and it's really, really uncomfortable to talk about. And I think that once that motive, if you like, is presented to you, I think it's quite difficult to kind of see past. But looking at where that angle came from, I think that, to explore that in detail, the racism angle originally came from an army jotter where Michael Ross had drawn a tiny swastika in the O of Ross and SS to match the Nazi SS in his surname. And at the time of the investigation, that was all. So that wasn't really presented as a motive until, a new detective had taken over the case years later. And it wasn't until later in the trial, well over a decade after that, that the witness statements revealed that Michael Ross had said these horrendous racist comments as a cadet.
Hazel's right about the Nazi insignia. The whole house was searched, and the only evidence the police could find on the searching of any racism was a tiny army jotter, as Hazel says, with the word Ross, with a tiny swastika in the O and SS as to match the German Nazi insignia. And that was what was put out in the papers. What Hazel is then going on to is the police statements. Now, the police statements were taken in Angus Chisholm's time. They just somehow weren't part of the kind of key agenda. Now, many cadets gave witness statements to the police. They were 14 and 15, quite often in the back of a Panda car by themselves, with no appropriate adult, no other help for them. I think today's lens would say that's improper policing.
Yep.
You've got an imbalance of power there. But what we can say, so we get past the awkwardness and what I think is inappropriate policing at that point of taking a minor and putting him into a place like that. And that's deeply problematic for me as a documentarian and from Hazel's point of view as a journalist. But if we get past that, we can see that Michael Ross was felt to have said some really deeply racist stuff. And these are cadets saying that. Now, that came out in a trial, so it didn't seem to be part of Angus Chisholm's work on the case. Ends about 1999, I think, and then he moves on. He starts working with Booker at Fiscal and so on. So it's just to do with his career as a detective, and we all have our career changes, if you like. I think when we saw the Nazi insignia, we could probably discount that in some ways as childish drawings. And it's important to say that Angus Chisholm, the lead detective in this case, said that he didn't even feel that was of anything of consequence. Brian McConaughey, who was a Crown prosecutor, he's the one who got Michael Ross found guilty. Brian McConaughey doesn't feel this was a racist killing either. Both have said that they're very, very clear that they felt that Michael Ross wanted to kill someone. And he didn't want to kill someone that was local, which you could read as local white Orcadian, but he wanted to kill someone who was other. You could read that as a person of colour in the only Indian restaurant in town. And that's their position. Now, I have different views on that one, as an idea, as a concept, but that's there too. And those are the two key people in this case. The guy who investigated it, and then the prosecutor who won the case. And both of them say this was a racist killing. Now, crucially, Michael Ross in his own audio tape gives a view on that. And he says that I was a stupid wee kid. And I probably said some horrible things. And he's embarrassed by it, looking back at that now. He lived in a community where there weren't many people of colour. He lived in a time where it was a far more innocent. But I think what he says is hugely damning and beyond just, I don't like brown people or I don't like that. It's abhorrent, it's heinous, and shouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to speak next about, episode 3, we met William Grant. And this was another of Hazel's moments.
My expressive moments.
When you are reading
I can't hide it, my face has receipts.
When you read out this anonymous letter from William Grant had put into the police station 12 years later.
Mm-hmm.
What were you thinking when you came across this letter then? What was your impression of it?
It was an anonymous letter, but it wasn't an anonymous letter.
Yeah.
Because he handed it into the front desk of Kirkwall Police Station. But the officer behind the desk knew who he was. He was William Grant. So I was just reading it and thinking that it was really strange. It was very curious, to use Stephen's favourite word, I think, and just trying to, to make sense of what he had said. I mean, I think I talk about it in the film where you're looking at all the different words being used to describe a gun. I think there's, firearm, I think there's Beretta, I think there's gun. And, when I say it, I just call a gun a gun. So it was looking through it with an eyebrow raised, thinking, okay, this is a bit, it's a bit weird. it's a bit odd. It didn't flow like, you know, I don't know whether I necessarily, and I don't, you know, it's not to say that I believe that what William Grant was saying was true or not, but the letter in itself is very strange. And yeah, and then that was just my reaction to that in real time.
So, Stephen, was William happy or more or reluctant to come on the documentary? Because I know he's had a hell of a time in court. So what was his reaction to coming on again?
William Grant was a very hard get for this series.
Okay.
And very hard to track down. William Grant was given death threats.
Oh.
So William Grant's effectively, he's not in hiding, but he is sort of off the radar. Very hard to track down.
Yeah.
Depending on who you believe, he was threatened off the island. You know, he was the undoing of Michael Ross. Hazel was really true in the kind of craziness of the letter that he wrote and the kind of the weird wordplay. Weird wordplay. Only because he changes his statements quite a lot as well in subsequent statements. William Grant changes where he was, why he came to Kirkwall, because he was on another island. Did he live in Kirkwall at that point? Didn't he live in Kirkwall? What the gun colour was it grey? Was it silver? What the guy was wearing? There's a lot of weirdness that happens at this point. And it's not helped by the fact that there's a Masonic link as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that you're allowed to be a Freemason, of course you are. You might suggest that one of the other detectives in this case was also a Freemason and knew William Grant from being at school, and they were school friends.
Oh, okay.
So some people say there was mystery in that side, and some people say don't be daft. I think this was strange because in the court case you begin to see that, you know, William Grant was uncertain whether he recognised Michael Ross in the toilet or didn't he, or he did. But quite a hard get.
He came across as quite a genuine guy in the programme. You know, I kind of felt a bit empathy for him. You know, I mean, I don't know whether it's the truth or not, but he came across quite well.
Good. He's vulnerable. He is a vulnerable person.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a vulnerable person.
Yeah. Were you able to ask him, because you want him to put his story across, did you feel comfortable able to ask him anything, you know, why did you close up so much on the trial, you know, or not?
So this is he has a short window in part 3, but actually it was probably one of the longest interviews I did for this whole thing. Him and Angus Chisholm, in fact, probably had the longest interviews. And William Grant, it was really important to go through so much in such a scrutinous detail. So he told his story first, and then I began, which I do with every contributor, then I began to pull it apart and go, what about this, what about that? And I would give him loads of documents during that interview and go, you said that then, you give me this sort of stuff. The passage of time is quite cruel sometimes, and time can be a cruel on the memory and stuff like that. And I think William Grant struggles with memory.
Right. And
some of the things he said, he no longer remembers. It was a very scrutinous interview and long, because we have a duty of care to all people, whether you think they're guilty or not, whether you think this person's lying or not. We have a duty of care. We have made sure that they understand what they're being part of, you know, and that's just ethical filmmaking, you know, and I think that's really important these days.
There was something he said that did confuse me a little bit, because he was in the toilets between 7 and 9 was the period he was in about, and the murder, we know, was at 7:10, was that right?
Yeah, so it's on 7:15, that kind of thing.
About 7:15. So he said this Michael came out of the toilet and he had his balaclava on and the gun, and he said he thought, he was terrified, he was worried because he thought, I could be the next victim. And I thought, well, if it was after the murder had happened, then why would this person, Michael or not, still be close to the scene with a gun and a balaclava when he's just committed a murder? Surely there would be some police presence or people around. And if it was before the murder, then how does he mean he could be the next victim if the murder's not happened yet? So that it's the only thing about that him that confused me a little bit.
Therein lies why, you know, people have issues with William Grant's testimony, because it is confusing.
Sometimes I meet contributors who they now believe that they could be the next victim, even though it doesn't chronologically make sense. They've got themselves into headspace because the passage of time says, I've had a trauma. It's like that Titanic moment with the clock, you know, the watch, it stops working. If William Grant's telling the truth, and there's a big if based upon other people. Some people say he did tell the truth, and some people say he didn't. But let's just say for this one, he did tell the truth, right? And he met him. You can imagine, again, going back to that thing of being in the restaurant, seeing a person in a balaclava rolled up and a gun would be deeply traumatizing. And you can see your brain trying to work that out over time. Then knowing that in William Grant's testimony that he was friends with Shamsuddin. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but he said he used to go drinking with Shamsuddin. William Grant's the kind of person you're never too sure what's true and not true and what is made believe.
Mm.
But I met enough people whose brain tells them that something is true even when something isn't true, that they believe it. And if I give my own stuff as an example, I was sure when I was a kid that I went on the Concorde. I was sure. I would have told anyone I was on the Concorde.
Were you on the Concorde?
We had no money for a Concorde, but I was sure, so sure that I'd been on the Concorde. I could tell you I was on the Concorde. I could even tell you a really weird story that I was in the cabin of a Concorde being shown by the captain, right? It never happened, but I was so sure as a kid, right? So sure. And I would have told everyone, right? And I'm sure I did tell them it never happened. It never, ever happened. We certainly didn't have that money. But William Grant has maybe got himself to a point where he believes certain things. And I noticed that with many contributors who are vulnerable, and William Grant is certainly a vulnerable person. Vulnerable probably before and vulnerable probably afterwards. He left the army. He was in the army for a wee while, but apparently discharged because he missed home too much.
Right.
So I don't think we should be sorry for William Grant personally. I think we can empathise with William Grant, and I think there's a real clear distinction. But that's not to be alert to some of the anomalies in his presentation and his witness statements, which change so frequently that caused us alarm, actually.
Well, another thing that caused me alarm, to be honest, was George Thompson. So he was the defence's investigator. He is the defence's investigator. Is he still the defence's investigator?
No, he's retired.
He's retired now. So that was a bombshell when you asked him the question if he thought Michael was guilty, and he said yes, because of who's an unknown witness that is discovered and spoke to. Did you get to see that in real time? Because your mouth just dropped open as well, Hazel. Or was that?
Yeah, because it was a bombshell moment. So when we were filming it, that is my reaction to that. And I just think that for me, for the series, it is one of the things that stands out and something that you take home, because I think that those who we spoke to along the way were obviously very firmly in camps. And I know that's not exactly what George Thompson's job would have been. You know, it's all evidence-led, and it's his job to help prepare the defence, help in the preparation of the defence. But coming from that side of it, you could see, and there's a load of tension, I think, in the lead up to what he's saying. And then you hear Stephen asking him, and I think you can see the cogs turning. This is a man who, you know, has had his career, who was involved in this case, which is so infamous. People talk about it still to this day. And I think to kind of see the cogs turning in George Thompson's head, he was, to me, looked like he was very carefully considering what he was about to say and almost kind of get it off of his chest. And I don't know, obviously, and we don't know if that was an opinion that he's always held. But for him to then say to Stephen, yes, I think that Michael Ross killed Shamsuddin Mahmood. I mean, my jaw hit the floor, quite literally. And I think that was definitely like one of the biggest things for me. It was really shocking, I thought.
It was a cracker.
Yeah.
So when did you speak to him, Stephen? Was that after you'd spoken to everybody else? Because I'm curious, could you get anybody else's reaction to what he'd said? Or
So just to go back one second, give you context. So George Thompson's defence investigator, so his job is during the trial to get all the new information. So he has to re-interview people and try to get an understanding. The sole defence that Michael Ross had for this case was a case of alibi, that he wasn't in the restaurant. He was sort of another part of Kirkwall talking to two friends, one of which was a cadet. So he was a young male and a young female, both the same sort of age, 14, 15, as Michael Ross was at that point. And so if he was there, he could be there, because he couldn't be meeting these friends and talking to them at 7 o'clock when the murder was at 7:10, 7:15. So George Thompson's role was to try to look at the alibi, along with other roles, but one of the roles was to try to look at that alibi and try to really make sense of it. And that's one of the things we tried to do in this series as well, because it's a single defence line of Michael Ross's campaign, if you like, for his innocence. And when you look at it, you start breaking down the elements, you begin to realise this is quite difficult because the two people who he talked to in 94 gave 3 witness statements to the police each. So that's 6 witness statements between 2 people. In each of those statements, they say we didn't see Michael Ross.
Okay.
But to Michael Ross's side, Michael Ross, in the very first time he was interviewed in September 94, he gave a route that he went on his bike from home after dinner, and then he went to see these people by chance as he was cycling up. And Michael Ross did do quite a lot of exercise because he was always trying to get into the army. So we know from other people anecdotally that he was always trying to get fit, whether that was running or cycling or other sport, that kind of stuff. Did a lot of sort of hill walking, that kind of thing. So George Thompson's trying to look at that, and there is a jaw-dropping moment when he says that unexpected, and that's one of the beauties of documentary, because people can say the most amazing things that you don't expect, And it's the same with every contributor. You talk to people, you look at Eddie and Moira Ross, for instance, and Eddie's telling you why he went to the police about the bullets. And then you see the face on Moira. I wish you hadn't done it because it destroyed the family, effectively. And he was saying because it was 3 cameras going at that point, and you can see this thing where she's saying, yeah, it kind of ruined us, effectively. And it's quite a beautiful moment, unexpected. George Thompson was unexpected, really unexpected. And Hazel's reaction when she rewatched it in the studio was powerful as well, because she's got that way of just snapping you into an audience going, this is that moment. For some people, they need a certainty. And I think George Thompson gave them that certainty of the guilt of Michael Ross. And it's compelling because George Thompson was working for the Michael Ross's campaign.
Yeah.
So he has a lot to lose by saying that openly. And I don't think he said it lightly. Hazel said that really well, which is you see him pausing as he's beginning to work out, will he say this or not?
Is it worth saying? Yeah. I think, just to add to that, I think just what you're saying, Stephen, about throughout the case, there is so much. I mean, in the eyes of the law, obviously, Michael Ross was tried and he was found guilty of this murder, of the murder of Shamsuddin Mahmood. Legally, that is what happened. He is in prison now. But I think with a lot of uncertainty on either side, depending on what you believe happened, this was a moment that was exactly what Stephen is saying, was kind of certain. Not for, necessarily for what I think happened, because as you know, I still don't know, but it was a moment of clarity in the series, whereas there was so much coming from either side.
And if I can add to that, Karen Tulloch saw the series. Eddie Ross and Moira Ross saw the series. These are both people who you would expect to be angry at George Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
You would expect that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
The generosity of Eddie Ross and Moira Ross and Karen Tulloch was that, yes, they were frustrated by what George just said, and they were upset by what George said. They felt a sense of betrayal. But all 3 parties recognise that George has a right to say his own view.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the power of all 3 of them. They all recognise that they were upset and quite, frazzled and taken back by that, because he'd never said that to them.
Right.
But they also recognise that he has his own right to say what he believes, just like they've been given the opportunity to say what they believe. And I think that's quite amazing, actually, because it's rare you meet contributors that can have that kind of generosity of spirit when they believe that their son and the person who you've campaigned for years is innocent. And they can have that generosity of spirit to say, you can still say what you say. I don't agree. I wish you didn't say it. He can say that. It's, not great, but it's fine.
That is really understanding. As it would have been a bit of a sucker punch, I think, wouldn't it, when they saw that the first time? Do you know anything about Michael's time in prison? I mean, what's it been like for him? So, is he always trying to escape? What's going on?
I don't know a lot. I mean, I know he's tried to escape, I think, 3 times. So, he's been moved around the prison estate, as you'd expect, I think he's pretty well respected within the prison. He has, a lot of contact with his family back home, and his wife and his kids. And so I think he tries to do very well. I can't speak to him directly, so I have no way to kind of speak to him. But as far as I understand, he's doing okay, Michael's chosen a difficult path because he's maintained his innocence. Now, if Michael is innocent, that means he's in for a hard ride, because to get out, he needs to show contrition. As far as I understand, he needs to show contrition. And part of that is owning up. So if you don't believe you did it and say you didn't do it, then the path to getting out early is quite difficult, as far as I understand. So it's a difficult one. His decision to try to escape, for him, it's about trying to keep his name in the papers and trying to draw attention to his campaign, his miscarriage of justice campaign. To a person who believes in Michael Ross's guilt, that's deeply problematic. I mean, some of the stuff he was doing is like Shawshank Redemption style.
Really?
It was amazing. One of the stories where he, I think there's like he's in the kind of woodwork kind of department, and there's a big thing that could almost cut bars of the prison cells. And as far as I understand, he created like a balsa wood or type equivalent of that. And it was only when a member of staff, one of the wardens, tried to put that big, heavy bit of metal that could cut metal into the cupboard, he lifted it up and realised,
Oh, no.
so that's Shawshank
That is
Redemption.
intricate.
That is intricate. That's planned and stuff like that. There's been things like that. Michael Ross would maintain that that's him trying to draw attention to his case.
Okay.
Other people would maintain that is not a good look to a person who contends their innocence. I am unsure about that. I find it actually okay, probably, that he's tried to escape. If I really put my head to it, I find that understandable. He wants to see his family. I find the trying to escape in court when he's been told he's guilty and a car, I find that highly problematic.
Yeah. Like I said, the car's one thing, but the ammunition and the guns is something else. Yes.
It's the pre-planning,
Yeah.
I think, that's problematic. It's a pre-planning. It's a gun that's smuggled from Kosovo, that's loaded with 500 plus bullets, 540 plus bullets. The type of a machine pistol it is, it's like a spray gun almost. It's not my understanding when I spoke to someone else who understands guns, it's not a one that's very good for target shooting.
Okay.
Because it's a bit like the AK-47 kind of equivalent, just a
lot of damage. Yeah.
A lot of damage, but not so good for hunting deer, which is what I think he said.
Well, I've really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on the case. All the behind-the-scenes insights and spoilers too. I'd just like to end by asking, do you have any projects you're working on or have coming up?
Well, nothing commissioned, nothing in the pipeline, but I think you're a good person to say this to, Dawn, because I guess, we're always in the market for if there's a story, a case, anything that you think warrants further attention in the same way that we have done, something that does have a big paper trail to go over, or there are lots of unanswered questions, or just anything mysterious that you or your listeners feel like we should be looking at, then to absolutely let me know or let us know.
Oh, brilliant. How about you, Stephen?
We've got 2 projects in contention. One is just fallen through a couple of days ago, and so I'm just waiting to see what happens with the other ones. But I try to choose the projects very carefully, of what projects I feel I can do something with, and what projects I feel that I can kind of find a way to communicate something different to an audience, And so I'm always trying to find, rather than racing to the next project, it's trying to find something I feel that I identify with, there's something in it that compels me inside the story,
Well, it's been really lovely speaking to you both. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us on. It's been a really, really interesting conversation and great to meet you. And yeah, I've really enjoyed chatting.
Donna, it's been such a delight to be on your podcast. It's been really good.
If you would like to get in touch with Hazel or Stephen regarding a story you feel needs further investigation, you can contact Hazel on Instagram at Hazel Reporting, and you can contact Stephen via his website, stephenabennett.com. Both links will be in the show notes. And of course, if you haven't already, you can watch The Man in the Mask, an Orkney Murder, now on BBC iPlayer. After speaking with Hazel and Stephen for this episode, I did watch the series again, and it definitely added another layer after hearing the spoilers and what went on behind the scenes, so I'd highly recommend giving it a watch. Again, the link to this documentary will be in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this chat with investigative journalist and host Hazel Martin and producer Stephen Bennett. Thank you as always for listening. We'll be back in next week with another Scottish Murders episode, this time a listener request case from 1986.